for about 2 years prior to November the 13th last year. The Namibian, but also other media, alluded in a series of reports that there were definitely questions about fish core and Samaji, but the full details hadn't come out. The reasons why we know this would probably happen again if it was happening now, we haven't, as Federico said, we've got no meaningful asset declarations in place. So for any system to work, you have to have some verification process. In Parliament, basically the MPs can put down whatever they like, and they can obscure or hide whatever they like in their declaration forms. Nobody within the system will check it and make sure this is accurate. There's no real comeback or consequences if they do obscure their assets and interests. And then, of course, we know that, as we've explained, only the President and Karish-Lettwein have actually declared their assets in any detail in terms of people in the executive. So that clearly isn't working as a system, and neither is the parliamentary system. Also because they don't do it on an annual basis, they seem to find every excuse they can for delaying, claiming they don't understand the forms and so on. The Fisheries Ministry is still shrouded in secrecy despite the claims from the new Minister Albert Kowanen that there would be a lot more openness and transparency in the future. As part of our ongoing research, we've requested about 6 weeks ago, we wrote a formal letter to the Ministry Executive Director requesting a whole lot of information, basic information, about which companies have quotas, which companies have rights, details for each type of species, each type of TAC. We haven't yet had any responses. We keep being told to be patient. But this is information that should be at the fingertips of a whole load of senior officials. If you look at the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources website, it's like a time warp. It's like it's frozen in 2012. You can't find anything beyond that. And it's interesting that, you know, as far as you can tell, that's around the time that these fish rot type schemes started to be developed inside the ministry and with the companies. We still, we've highlighted this in several reports. It's very hard in Namibia to find out who owns companies. So if you go to BIPA, you know, they're supposed to be digitizing their records, well, going back to the time when it was a department in the Ministry of Trade years ago, and we're still dealing with bits of paper. Our recent efforts to establish which companies were getting emergency procurement tenders during the state of emergency found that a lot of these companies are either just not recorded as existing at BIPA, or their files have disappeared, or the records are incredibly out of date. So establishing who owns what, you know, is still really difficult. Never mind having to sort of be able to look and see, well, are those people named as directors or shareholders the actual owners, or are they actually front people, proxies, which is where the whole issue of beneficial ownership comes in. Who really owns these entities? As we know, as has been explained, there's still no meaningful protection for whistleblowers in place. So Johannes Stephenson has to depend on one clause in the Anti-Corruption Act, which says that if you do give information that is crucial to a prosecution, you can have some form of exemption. But you know, I think he's in a very difficult position, the only reason why fish rot really has come out is because of what he initiated as a whistleblower. So we know the importance of whistleblowers now, but still, a year on, we don't have any of the whistleblower the whistleblower protections in place because the law has not been operationalised. The other issue, I think, which we haven't even started to address, although we've all known that we've all recognised that the Minister of Fisheries, former Bernard Essau, deliberately changed the law and got a law amended in Parliament, the Marine Resources Act, to allow him to have the discretion to basically allocate and enable the fish lot scandal to take place. And despite that, our laws continue to have clauses, including the laws that are dealing with the minerals sector, oil and gas, a huge amount of discretion that can be used by senior officials and ministers to decide on who gets quotas, licenses, etc. So we haven't started to address that. In fact, it's probably getting worse because the Namibia Investment Promotion Act, which is actually a passed law but not yet operational, is also has even more of that element of a minister having huge amounts of discretion, which is why investors have objected, because it just gives a lot of arbitrary power to ministers who could use it in ways that are corrupt or other ways that are certainly not facilitating investment. The other issue that we don't even talk about in Namibia, but it is being addressed in other countries, is the idea of publishing all the key contracts between government, and especially those who are active in fisheries and the rest of the extractive sector. When we suggest this to both officials and companies, to be honest, the private sector, they look aghast at us and say, but what about our secrecy and commercial our rights to commercial secrecy? But yet this is becoming more and more of a standard across the world, so it's something we have to address in Namibia. So the grim news is that I think fish rot could definitely still happen. But there are a couple of factors, of course, which are positive. I mean, one is the arrests of the kickback kings, as they're known. And the very fact that were arrested, and that so far as we can tell, the judicial process and the prosecutorial process has been a serious one, is at least some kind of disincentive to other people who might be thinking of or planning or active in these kind of corrupt schemes. So the fact that we're still a long way, of course, from convictions, but the fact that so far the process has, I think, been handled reasonably professionally by the various actors is at least one positive. But perhaps the biggest factor, which I think we need to remain conscious of going forward, is the level of public outrage that this fish lot scandal engendered. And there's no doubt that those demonstrations at the end of last year and the expressions of anger and outrage were and are important in terms of making sure the process does remain on track and keeping the minds of those who are involved in carrying out this investigation focused, and to make sure there is no mistakes, or deliberate or not, that could allow this case to collapse. So really, I think our appeal is to let's keep on this level of public pressure and public engagement on the issues of corruption, because that does make a difference. And the more we speak out and the more we show that this is not acceptable, totally against what we want to see happening in Namibia, the more likely the authorities will not find excuses for not going through and to the logical end of these things, which is prosecution. We didn't actually outline other cases. Of course, there's a whole series of cases across the last 5 years, which we hope to look at in another paper. But obviously the Quora Awards, the SME Bank, and several more we could mention are signs, are similar cases where we're nowhere near really where we want to be in terms of actually nailing down who was responsible and moving towards convictions. So I think to end in a sort of positive way, the paper that's been launched today, that's on the website, if you look at that, we close out with our suggestions that have been around for a year now. We launched them on International Anti-Corruption Day, December the 9th last year. 8 actions for which the President and the whole of the executive could demonstrate that they do have genuine political will to tackle corruption. And these are not terribly difficult things, and they're also not anything that interferes with the court process or the judicial process, because the President often says, I can't act because this is now part of a judicial process and the case is in court, and we accept, of course, that he cannot and should not interfere in any of that, nor should anybody else in government. But the 8 actions that we recommended last year, included at that point, it was before or around the time of the election, was to remove the corrupt MPs from the National Assembly. I think despite his pleas that he wasn't convicted of corruption, we still have one SOPO MP in the National Assembly. And what was perhaps more disturbing recently was that SOPO declined to even consider removing Saki Shangala and Bernard Essau from the SWAPO structures, the Central Committee and the Politburo, on the grounds that they are not yet convicted of anything. So there's a prospect that if these guys do eventually get bail, they'll be sitting in the SWAPO Politburo and affecting the SWAPO and broader governance issues. But obviously any organisation that is fit for purpose, including political parties, should be able, through their constitutions and their rules and regulations, to at least suspend people accused of gross misconduct. And then that just seems to be an obvious thing, which is actually something that everybody would appreciate, that these people are out of the picture, let the court process proceed, but they are not involved in any serious decision-making bodies in government or in the party. This is confirmed by our experiences of the statements and activities of the Ministry of Fisheries this year, since a new minister was appointed, is that they're not serious about opening up or being transparent, and that the only way that we can really find out what has happened in terms of the overall rights and quotas regime in the Ministry of Fisheries is to have some kind of formal inquiry, whether it's a presidential inquiry or another way of setting up an inquiry headed by a judge. Obviously this maybe can't go into the fish rots issue specifically because it is a court case now, but there are lots of other issues about the way the quotas and the rights are being handled and managed by the ministry that could be investigated, including which system is best for allocating these quotas. So on paper, auctions look like a good idea because it's an open competitive system, and who's, and at least Minister Shimi was fairly open about who applied and the names of the companies and so on. But of course it was done in such a rushed and unplanned way that it actually ended up being a little bit of a disaster. And so I think that the correct way of doing these things could be recommended by some kind of official inquiry that actually looks at international experience and looks at the best way of doing this in Namibia that will rule out future corruption. So the only way really, it's been proven that the voluntary system of ministers declaring does not work. And we know these fish rot figures were lying because they have farms all over Namibia, they have luxury villas and golf estates near Cape Town that were never appeared in any declaration that they made as MPs. So there has to be a new approach to the issue of declaration of assets. And one of those should be that basically they are required to hand over some kind of declaration to the President, but this is kept secret. So let's just make it mandatory that those declarations are made public. If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to worry about. So as we've stressed again and again over the last 3 years, time is long past now to operationalise the whistleblower law. The fact that not even any money has ever explicitly been allocated in the national budget. You can look through the Ministry of Justice budget, and there's no budget line for whistleblowing. The new Minister of Justice has tried to say she will do her best to set up some kind of skeleton staffing system this year to start things moving. So there's a little chink of hope there, but really a delay of 3 years just is another factor which underlines the lack of a political will to deal with these issues. And one just has a sense that, you know, they know that another Johannes Stephenson or somebody in that vein who comes out, you know, could do some very serious damage, and presumably that's why. I can't think of any other reason why they're dragging their feet so seriously on this. I mentioned that BEPA is not fit for purpose in terms of being able to provide information on company details and directors of companies in any kind of consistent way. But also we need to move to a system where the Ministry of Mines, the Ministry of Fisheries and others has public beneficial ownership registers for all the companies they interact with in terms of quotas and licenses, petroleum, oil and gas, fisheries, mining, all this needs to be opened up. We've consistently also recommended that we join the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI. That does contain within it a lot of commitments to open contracting and beneficial ownership registers. The ministry, over the years, the Ministry of Mines has just said, we don't have the money to join this, which is, you know, I'm thinking today about the headline in the Sun, on front of the Sun, that there's a new 4.7 billion business plan to rescue Namibia, Air Namibia on the table. And, you know, I think the registration, the fees for joining something like the EITI, you know, are probably tens of thousands of US dollars, but and then secondly that it just doesn't suit Namibia. So we're not getting very good explanations here. And again, one thinks, we've also said, well, if you don't want to join it, why not just look at some of their best practices that they recommend and adopt some of them instead. So the only areas where we've seen any progress really is access to information law is now in Parliament, so there's something moving there. And then just purely on the other thing that we said, that the President should definitely declare his assets, and earlier this year he said he intended to do that, but it hasn't happened as yet. You know, it's not good enough to have an individual voluntary system, as we've said already, but at least the President was setting an example when he did it in 2016. So I think we need to also urge the President to keep to that commitment and declare his assets again. So I just wanted to end the thing by saying, look, you know, this is a pretty grim situation. We've gone through 5 years with not many signs of progress, and yet with 4 years left to run in his second term, the President could actually do quite a lot, which would actually change that situation. And as I say, it's nothing to do with interfering with court cases or ongoing investigations. They're all actions that can be taken. You know, basically, most of the public policy reforms and actions that could be taken in a relatively short time frame. But we haven't seen this kind of comprehensive approach. So I think on that, I'll hand back to Federico, and then if there are questions and comments. Thanks very much.
So, are there any questions or comments? Yes, there are.
Usually it's professional, but I beat it to this. Federico, this is really old news. Like you said, it's We keep talking about, we keep going in circles.
Mm.
And these recommendations have been there as well. Where to from here? Because repercussions.
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that we have to continue talking about. I mean, the things aren't being fixed, the systems aren't being fixed, the processes aren't being fixed, the institutions aren't being fixed. And if you look at, sort of the things that were supposed to be addressed through the National Anti-Corruption Strategy and so on, you sort of get that sense. It's once again that issue of slow implementation, under-implementation, that sort of thing. And these are the things that continue affecting the quality of our institutional frameworks, the quality of our governance architecture. So, I mean, the point for us was, these themes, these topics keep coming up in presidential statements. We really need to challenge this and demand, to say, that this isn't reflected in what's happening in terms of actual tangible deliverables on anti-corruption. And people need to start seeing that. And that's the point. And this is, we need to hold the politicians, from the president on downwards, accountable for their statements. They can't just be making statements, claiming things are happening, and quite clearly things aren't happening. And that's the point. It's also, keeping people informed about, look, folks, this is, it all sounds good when it's being said. It's been said for 5 years straight, but what do we actually have to show for this? There was another hand, yes.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Simon. When I was listening to Graham, he spoke about something like suspending MPs who are accused of corruption, and giving the example of Shangara Nisa from the Politburo. But then I always had a persistent question that never got answered. For example, in the case of Mike Mupunya, as we speak, he's still the CEO of Fishco because he was suspended and not fired. So basically, he could be correcting his paycheck every month since he's suspended. So I want to understand, why is it that people, when they are accused of something like that, are always suspended instead of maybe being fired, or at least don't take any action, because at least the Governance Act will not allow this person to be the CEO for over a year while they are in prison. But if you suspend them, you are giving them an opportunity to keep making this organization suffer. Even in today's newspaper, they are saying that the managers are saying they could maybe not even afford to pay the salaries for the employees for the next month. But this guy is in prison, yet he's correcting his paycheck. So,
I mean, that's part of all these systems and processes. I mean, the issue of suspending officials and these long, drawn-out disciplinary processes and things, these all have cost Namibian taxpayer money over the years. And people have been, people's dismissal have been recommended. I'm thinking of about a number of where I know and where reports have, there have been reports of people's dismissals having been recommended. And still those people are in those positions. Disciplinary process has been completed. Long drawn out disciplinary process in which they were suspended. Their dismissal has been recommended, but they're still in the position. So so these are just some of the issues that we point out. These are the issues that speak to the statements that the President himself has made. But there are so many other institutional systems where things just aren't working. And these sorts of things are enabling of corruption and of waste and of mismanagement.
Yeah. Because for me, I see this, maybe it's boards trying to protect their cohorts so that they don't suffer financially. You'll find there are a lot of cases, like you mentioned, for example, NIP bosses, they have been out of the offices for over a year But these guys are getting paid over 1.1 million per year, and they are collecting that paycheck for the whole year without doing a thing. While there are people also active in their position.
Yeah. And you find this from villages, through towns, through SOEs, through government departments, where people have been suspended in the disciplinary process. So these are the issues. These are the issues that people need to keep in mind when they're thinking about and listening to these statements by politicians. And that where there needs to be accountability. And I think in a future, the paper we were sort of referring to speaks to this culture of impunity in government, because there's a lot of that. People aren't being held accountable for waste, mismanagement and corrupt actions. And there are so many cases that just haven't gone anywhere in Namibia, in the court system. And these people are still in their positions. So there are so many systems and processes and institutions that are right now in a state of dysfunction and undermining because of issues that aren't being addressed. Any other questions or comments?
It's really sorry I came late, but I got the gist of the discussions. I think it's important that we understand that the SWAPO's or the ruling party's entire power structure is based on a corrupt patronage network. Until we address that issue from the top up to the lowest possible level, we will not be able to address systemic corruption either in state institutions, government offices, or ministries. That's where we need to start as a party that is currently in power.
Yeah. I don't know what to respond to. Yeah. All right. Any other comments?
Very good. Thank you very much, everyone. Just want to point it out that the private sector is the innocent partner in this. I think it's worthwhile saying that the private sector dance to the tune mostly set by the government. And but obviously also the link between the businessmen and politicians created that environment. So yeah, what I haven't seen from the report is that basically what is the private sector's great areas in the private sector. I mean, there is an AMCO, I think in the last 5 years, I don't remember which area we're in. I think that needs to be mentioned, although it's a watered down version of P3, very much.
Yeah.
And then also the Deloitte and Touche report on corporate governance 2016.
Yeah.
I think there's not a later one since 2016, in which I think it's worthwhile looking at that as well.
Yeah.
And then also the role of the private sector in fighting corruption. That report is 2018
Yeah.
by the IPR.
Yes, by you. Yeah.
So I think that's important to say that the private sector is, you know, they don't have the courage to stand up. They get isolated. They don't get tenders. If you do that, we've seen it in the construction industry. We've seen it in many industries. So the question is, to what extent can we hold private sector accountable, and to what extent not? Can we hold the bigger companies more accountable than the smaller ones, or is it across the board? And then on the other side, what is the citizens' accountability? We sitting here, what's our accountability? And it depends on in which role and spheres you are functioning.
Yeah.
So,
if
we look at the points, I think from Fischer coming out, there was a number of firsts. First March, very beginning of the agency, every ministry. I think there was 3 first marches in that. I think that's a good sign, but as you said quite rightly, do we keep the momentum, or is anything? It will keep the momentum until the next election, I see, or I foresee, and then it will slowly die down. But we don't have the capacity in Namibia to do forensic investigations. Unless we get international money and international expertise. It will die a sudden death. Organized, the private sector. That is the big challenge. Because everyone protect his own profit, his own business. And I don't think you will see a cohesion there. We have tried it with Enterprise Namibia. But I think it's worth mentioning that the money is there, the private sector is there, they can make a difference, but how do we create cohesion?
Look, I mean, that's a question you could ask of, and that's a question we've asked of, why do we not see the Namibian church sector, the religious sector? Why have we not seen any churches say anything about corruption in this country? Why are we not hearing from the churches? We claim to be Christians in this country, and that isn't happening. If you can point me to a substantive statement of any of the church organizations in this country having said something substantive about corruption, I'd be happy to see it. We've asked the same question. I wrote a paper we launched last month about why is civil society in Namibia not coalescing around an anti-corruption platform? Like, for instance, in South Africa with Corruption Watch. And Corruption Watch is also supported by Business South Africa. And funded a lot, its funding comes from a lot from Business South Africa. And that is also a platform through which the business in South Africa is trying to get across its anti-corruption message and trying to, without directly, because business people are cautious in their dealings with the state, because they want to do business in the procurement system. So they don't want to directly antagonize the bureaucrats. So they use platforms such as Corruption Watch and others to speak to the issues that concern them. Why Namibia has the business sector in this country not created a platform similar to that? So there are questions to ask about various sectors in this country. Why have we not created the platforms that speak to our concerns on corruption in this country? I can't answer that question, to be honest. That's a question you need to ask of those people. So I fully agree with you, but our focus very much is because of the outsized, disproportionate role that Namibian state government plays in this country's economy. Government has to set the tone in terms of anti-corruption. And everybody else will if government has set the tone, everybody else will, the private sector, civil society, everybody else will fall sort of in line with that tone and go along with that. But government needs to set that tone because of the disproportionate impact and influence of government in this country. Of course, you can do it, go it alone and see how far that gets us. We are where we are. And if we look at the fish rod case, and if you looked at those files, the number of firms, lawyers, accountants, financial services, banks, all of these sectors that were involved in an enabling of this corruption, of this alleged corruption. Yes, of course, always. Of this alleged corruption. It speaks to, there are serious questions that need to be asked of various private sector segments in this country, and how these private sector operators are enabling of corruption in this country. So there are questions to be asked of a whole range of people, but for us it starts with, we need to be asking and holding our government accountable for what's happening. So that's where everything starts. And that's why we focus very much on governance systems, processes, institutions within the state sector. Any other? Yes.
My feeling is that all of this is a symptom of something. And what you just said about government. How can government and the private sector and civil society organizations be motivated to act on this? Because there hasn't been any action, not just the past 5 years, but the past 30 years. You know, what could be, I don't know, to me it's very frustrating. You know, we can talk really nice things and you know, all this is great, but how could people really be motivated? How can they benefit from acting on stopping corruption?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think people who do advocacy around these sorts of things really need to step into this space. And that's where we always talk to some of our associates about, you know, what sort of messaging would work in this space. And you know, there's some research around talking to people about corruption and how it actually demotivates people, how it actually discourages people, because people then just think, I can't do anything about this. This is too much. I'm just going to focus on my little thing and try and get ahead and stay focused on my things. I'm not corrupt. And that's really not. So how do you get people to take ownership of what's happening? You know, that is a question that remains to be answered. To be honest. You wanted to say something?
No, I'm just saying, I've sat in a situation where we've been faced with this sort of thing. We've sat around tables and discussed, corruption. And as a company, if you work for a company, you can't go out and be a whistleblower because it might affect the company. You cannot do that. I've said to people that have tackled me in offices about corruption, forensic auditors actually, that I can't, on behalf of the company, speak, because if you go and have a look at all your utilities and all that sort of thing, their record of taking people out or removing people that are corrupt is very, very bad. And if you do go out and come out and say anything about it, you're not likely to get any kind of tenders in the future over there. So you are going to damage your own company's reputation over there. I've attended where groups of companies have got together to discuss wholesale corruption and all that sort of thing. And we've sort of got one of the companies to start spearhead an investigation where they have the least to lose by this sort of thing. And you know, the problem is you need proper evidence to be able to take people down. And it's very difficult to come forward with that evidence or to find that evidence. Now, what I've told forensic auditors before is I'll give you the information that I know, but I can't give it to you officially. I can give it to you, and it's up to you to go and investigate. It's not difficult to go and find this information. You'll find people, as you say, get suspended, but they remain there, and their friends are still operating in these organizations. And you are going to affect your business if you do it. And that is the power that exists in the companies. And besides that, if you go to our utilities, for instance, Manpower and the municipalities, all the senior engineers run their own companies.
Yeah.
They all have private companies. Some of them even have the impunity to advertise themselves as consulting engineers. We know that down at the coast and all that sort of thing, they're doing all their own consulting work, and it's all in-house being done, being done over there. And
using their work email addresses even to do this.
Exactly. I mean, I know for a fact that you have jointers working that are busy doing joints over there during the day for a private company that invoices the municipality, and they're using your longer rent vehicles and all that sort of thing to do it over there. It's happening with such impunity, and the people know that it's happened for so long, and nobody does anything about it. There's no accountability for it whatsoever. And it's become such a huge thing that I don't think it's in the ambient of any politician to even tackle it now. And besides which, we're sitting with the incumbent party has such huge financial backing behind them, probably international backing as well. I mean, the new building that they're building at the moment over there is just an indication of the amount of money. And yet your other parties have nothing, they have no funding, they cannot afford to do anything in these things. So in other words, we really are a one-party state.
On the topic of international actors, do you think that there's a role for international actors in changing the course of this conversation? Because thinking about like who is the government accountable to? If there's a lot of restraints on the private sector, disincentivization to get involved, when there's a lot of dependency on foreign investment, do you think that there should be more of a role? Or,
Well,
I mean, and there's obviously the perception of getting involved in another state's business, but do you think, like, with like the fish rock thing,
Look, you know, there are so many, but let me first address what you just said. Yes, I mean, I spoke to for instance, the Manufacturers Association almost a decade ago when they were talking about they were going to create a anti-corruption charter for Namibian manufacturers. It's almost a decade. I don't know if Ronnie Varkenvisser is still there, but he was the one who I interviewed at that stage about this, because this was supposed to be a new thing. The Namibian manufacturers were going to come up with the anti-corruption charter and against, because at that stage there was this whole talk around the bribe paying that they had to do to get contracts and supply contracts and so on. And I interviewed him, I remember. I mean, it's almost a decade now. That anti-corruption charter has not seen the light of day. I think that's just been shelved because I think some intimidation might have taken place. If you go ahead with this, you're not going to get any supply contracts. So yes, but that's where the tone that is set within the state comes in. And I think because what you just sketched, that I mean, my business is going to be affected but if the tone from government is we're welcoming of trying to weed out these sorts of incidents, we're trying to create a new culture, we're open to people coming forward and you know, making these sorts of declarations and providing information that gets us to a new way of governance. Then I think people would come forward, of course, cautiously at first, but people would start, if it's demonstrated that this is what is happening, people will start coming forward. But that is not what we're seeing. We're not seeing a demonstration of that commitment and that anti-corruption will. We're not seeing that. So people aren't going to come forward with information. As to, you know, sort of outside actors, you know, you can ask any journalist in the room here. I mean, we know about the development partner sector where they would rather just report to Home Office, whoever they are, and say, we're going to lose this money because there's something untoward happening here. They're not going to be transparent to us Namibians because this is government-to-government stuff, for instance. And we know about development projects that have been severely corrupted, where money has just disappeared. Some of them have been reported in the media without anything happening, of course. And with the development partner denying it as well. But it happened. So that sort of international pressure that we thought we would see from development partners, and even some of the major ones, it hasn't happened. Despite there being projects being funded by them where they know that things aren't, there are things happening that shouldn't be happening.
Yeah, just quickly on the issue of possible international interest and intervention. I think we have to bear in mind on this anniversary of fish rot that although Namibia is 56 on Transparency International's CPI rankings, we have at least arrested people. We've initiated a serious investigation. Look at Iceland. They've completely tried to ignore the issue in their country. There's been no serious investigation thus far. Hardly anybody's been questioned. The head of Samaji has been back in his post after an initial short period of suspension. I've tried to approach some international media outlets, to do with this anniversary, to say, are you going to revisit fish rot? Don't you think it's interesting that Iceland, the 11th least corrupt country in the world, according to Transparency International, has essentially done nothing in 12 months on fish rot, Meanwhile, we at least, we know all our problems, but at least, this benighted African country of heart of corruption or whatever has actually initiated something, a lot to do with public pressure, I think. So the international role has potential, because we know that Fishrock really only gained momentum because it had that combination of Namibian media, Icelandic media, Al Jazeera, WikiLeaks, and others to actually force it into the open and to make the government here not just brush it aside as they tend to do in most of these cases. So it is important, but Namibia is just not on the international map, so it's very hard to get these international news agencies interested in following this up and revisiting the issue, even though it's very obvious that Iceland is supposedly a country that has a very good record on corruption, is not actually tackling this issue at all.
If I may abuse just for a few seconds again, I've thought a lot about the link between the private and the state. And there's one link, that's professionally the one that you pointed out. I mean, those are the facilitators that put legally, legalize actually corruption by their profession. The lawyers we have seen from Fishrock, a number of them involved. And also in the pharmaceutical industry, medical doctors, for example, also academic people, and architects and engineers. They are the glue that bind the private sector and the state together by putting services, license, permits, all those in place. So I suggest that we hold those people accountable, expose them on Facebook, on Twitter, expose them, because their own professional bodies are useless. I mean, I've tried to make a case against a lawyer at the legal society. I waited 6 months and nothing happened. The evidence was there. We have seen what happened to the law society with Fishrock. They were so compromised. So we as individuals need to hold professional people accountable, expose them, shame them. And that's one way we can do it, because they are the glue between the state and the private sector.
That's one way. I'll certainly say that's one way of doing that. Yeah.
Why do you think some cases are actually prosecuted quite quickly? A friend of mine, acquaintance of mine, was involved in a money laundering fraud case last year, and that case, I think, involved three or four people, and this guy has been prosecuted and put into jail for 5 years, and he's been told if he can put pressure on his fellow cronies, he can get to give back the money, or to say where the money is, then his sentence can be reduced. But I don't know, I'm wondering why a case like that has been prosecuted so quickly, and others have been, considered to
Given the political capital.
But I mean, so I mean, that is one of the issues in the future people were actually looking at, where there are these cases that over the last 10, 15 years that have just not gone anywhere. And people aren't aware of them, and there are so many of them. And we're going to actually look at some of them and say, what has become of this case? What has become of this case? Because there are so many of them. And I think the common denominator is probably the proximity to political power, if we're honest. So I mean, these are things that we'll be looking at. Just to say that, look, this, as Graham said, the picture is grim. I do not share that optimistic view. to be honest.
What do you want me to say?
It's grummer than grum.
It's grummer than grum, yeah. Because if you start looking, it doesn't matter which sector you look at. If you start looking, if you start scratching the surface, the things, the misgovernance, the bad governance, the mismanagement, the corruption, they just jump out. And I mean, I hear what you're saying, Johan, about shaming, naming and shaming and so on. I don't think that's going to work. People also have lives to lead, businesses to maintain, people to pay, salaries to pay. And it isn't that easy to just name and shame. There are other people that then are affected by that. It is Namibians having collectively to make a change to what's happening in this country. That is what needs to happen. People need to decide when enough is enough, and work from there. I think we'll end it there. This discussion can go on endlessly. The topics are really, we can run far with it. But I think we'll end it there. And please, I think we have some refreshments outside. Please join us. And thank you once again for coming and listening. And please do read the report. It's once again a gripping APR report.
We can email the report to you, but it is also on our website downloadable as of now. Hopefully the printed copies will be around on Monday. And just thanks again to all of you for coming. Let's keep on keeping on. I know it's been a bit of a depressing conversation, but I think the only thing we can do is to continue acting against corruption however we can from our situation. And I think some of us are trying our best, and I think journalists are doing a sterling job. We should commend them. I see a couple of them at the back there who are doing excellent work on exposing corruption. So let's just keep on keeping on and keep pushing for the right things. Yeah, there is some food outside, and thanks also to our partner on this, Hansard Foundation, who funded the report. Thanks very much.
Please fill in the
feedback forms.
Feedback forms.